Hey, I'd like to welcome you to the second module of the Natural Systems Agriculture course. My name is Martin Entz. I'm a professor in the Department of Plant Science at the University of Manitoba, and I hold the Jarislowsky Chair in Natural Systems Agriculture for Climate Solutions. So I'm going to share my screen, and then we will begin the lecture. Okay. So I hope you're well wherever you are and that you had a chance to watch Module 1. So in Module 2, I want to talk about some of the origins of the concept of nature-based solutions, give you some examples from Canada and internationally. And then I'm going to start discussing how we apply natural systems agriculture to the real world, starting from the soil, and then we'll be over the course of all these modules, be moving up to plants, animals, landscape, etc. from there. Okay, so we're into Module 2. So one question is, where did this nature-based concept come from? Well, we know that scientists have always worked hard to, or should work hard to be relevant to society. And so when it comes to the environment, we've often been promoting green concepts that have come out of scientific research. Scientists have measured the environmental impact of different things. And so that's, really a framework in which a lot of, scientific endeavor happens. And there is this boundary, certainly, between science and broader society. And we need to have really good communication going both ways. But when we look at the question of where did the natural systems agriculture concept come from, it's always been around. Ancient civilizations have thought about this. But in the modern era, we had the Rio Summit in 1992, which was sponsored by the United Nations. And it was, in the modern era, one of the biggest meetings talking about the environment. And there was participation across the world. And I do remember George Bush Sr. saying, we'll participate, but Americans will never change their lifestyle. And, that was the attitude back then, 30 years ago. And we've come a long way since then. So in terms of agriculture, there's a very many books written about things like farming in nature's image. And this is a Solon Piper book. I think it's in the 1990s. And the foreword was by Wes Jackson, who we heard about yesterday, or in Module 1. And then in terms of, after the Rio Summit, the World Bank in 2008 actually released a report on nature-based solutions to all kinds of things, not just agriculture. And then a few years later, the IUCN, we'll talk about them, they released something in 2009. And since then, we've just had a lot more activity in this area. So the World Bank, if you don't know much about them, it's good to look them up. They are major players in this sphere. And like they say, you should follow the money if you want to know how things work. So in terms of the World Bank in 2008, they created a nature-based solution invest project, and they made the economic case for nature, a global Earth economy model to assess development policy pathways. So they looked at nature as a development asset. And this is an important step in the process. And in their analysis, they looked at what would happen to the GDP. Remember, in Module 1, we talked about GDP per unit of oil. Here's GDP if we wouldn't do anything to improve natural systems. And what we find is that in low and lower middle income countries, the cost of doing nothing is very high. It's a 7%, a 10% decrease in gross domestic product. If we look at high income countries like Canada, for example, the cost of doing nothing is much smaller. And I think those of us who live in high income countries understand that because many of these countries have not been, colonized for that long. And so they're large, Russia, Canada, Australia, we haven't um, we haven't done as much damage to our natural ecosystem. And then but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. And then when they looked at the different types of ecosystem services, they broke it down into things like pollination and fisheries. And you can read this report on your own. It's on the web. The other organization I mentioned is the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And they started promoting nature-based solutions significantly in 2009. And one of the things they did is they listed criteria for success. So the IUCN global standard for nature-based solutions has 8 criteria that help users assess the effectiveness of the nature-based solutions. They are: you need to be addressing a societal challenge. You need to be able to do this at scale, that's over a large area. You need to ensure environmental sustainability and social equitability. Needs to be economically viable. It needs to recognize trade-offs. It needs adaptive management. That is a whole area of learning. What does adaptive management mean? You could study that. And it needs to be mainstreamed into policy. So those are the 8 criteria that the IUCN has come up with. And then we have the European Union, who've really pushed nature-based solutions, including in agriculture. And but they're interested in not only food production, they're also interested in nature-based solutions for cities, for urban development, for transportation, and other activities. Now, this publication here compared the definitions of nature-based solutions by the IUCN and the European Commission. And what strikes me here is the IUCN definition is a little bit more about conservation, and the European Union is a little bit more about living solutions using nature to design things to be resource efficient. So they're very similar, but a slightly different focus. And it makes sense because the European Commission is really about, different industries. Can those industries be made to be more natural? And if you wish, you could join this online webinar here, which is a Canada-EU project. And they have a webinar series called Life on a Farm, Nature-Based Solutions to the Climate Challenge. And I've given you some places to start listening to the link. And this one here by Alphonse Weersink, I think I misspelled his name there, sorry. As an economist with the University of Guelph, has a really good example of the policy tools that Canada has been using to promote nature-based solutions. And then there's another global organization, and this is the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, or the FAO. And they have also looked at nature-based solutions as a way of addressing and achieving Millennium Development Goals. When we get examples of nature-based solutions, what a lot of organizations have done is really focused on case studies. So telling a story where a community has improved their circumstances by by embracing natural processes. And here's an example from Japan, where the community changed the way they grew rice to not only produce paddy rice, but also to maintain wetlands as part of that ecosystem. So I just want to illustrate here that the case study approach is a very effective way to go. There are conferences around nature-based solutions. The Oxford University Museum of Natural History has been running nature-based conferences for a number of years, and you can learn more about them and also watch some of the videos from these conferences. In terms of scientific publication, peer-reviewed scientific publication, we can see a tremendous increase in the number of publications per year that mention nature-based solutions. And we can see that forest ecosystem and ecological restoration is certainly the most popular, at least it has been. Things like climate adaptation services, they're really just getting going. And so we even see some engineering, ecological and environmental engineering is pretty stable. And then ecosystem-based management is also going up, as is green and natural infrastructure. So, so that is an introduction as to where this concept of nature-based solution is coming from. It came from, and I'm now going to, ask you to pause the video and again, as we did in the previous module, take your ideas, write them down, put your questions, write them down, and put them in this hypothetical pot of soil. And we're going to come back to these ideas and come back to these questions in future modules, and we'll have a chance to have our ideas grow. Okay. So in agriculture, we are practical people. Got to be practical. Let's get realistic. How much can we actually apply nature? And agronomists want proof. Agronomists are making recommendations to farmers. This is serious work, and we need to use a science-based approach to our nature-based solutions. And so what I'm planning to do for the rest of the course is to discuss nature-based solutions going up this hierarchy. So we're going to start today with the soil, and then we're going to move to soil-plant relations and plants, then to animals, then to humans, and then to the ecosphere. All the while, we're going to keep our eye on some major forces here. One is the sun, which brings us our solar energy, and the other is the water cycle, which is so absolutely critical. So let's begin with the soil. Soil has three major components. It has chemical features, and here I've shown the periodic chart, so all the different macro and micronutrients in the soil are things that we measure, we can eat. We've been measuring these for quite some time. Then there's the soil physical structure. So for example, these aggregates, compaction, which I talked about in module 1. And the youngest discipline within soil science is the biological part of the soil. Those soil microbial entities that make up, 3-5% of the soil, but they are absolutely critical in transforming carbon, transforming nutrients, and other things. Here is just a model of a sort of a farming system. And what I've done in the crop production part of the model is I've just drawn red circles around the practices that involve soils. And my point here is just to show you that soils are really at a critical part of the production system. Now, we have been studying soils for a long time. This is a picture of the Morrow plots, the oldest crop rotation study in North America. And what they have measured there is what many other long-term studies have measured, is that when the original grassland was plowed, the soil lost a lot of its carbon. And after a certain time, the amount of carbon in the soil either stabilized if you had a good crop rotation, or it continued to decline slowly if you had a poor crop rotation. So this is some of the historical knowledge that has helped us understand. This next picture here is the soil zones of the Great Plains of North America. These are the northern Great Plains of the US, and this area here we call the Canadian Prairies. And where these stars appear is where long-term studies have been conducted in this region. There's probably a few more that I've missed, but these are the big ones that have been described in a lot of publications. A number of years ago, the Soil Health Institute funded a project where 121 long-term studies in North America, which includes Canada, the United States, and Mexico, were given the opportunity to have the soil completely assessed for soil health indicators. And this was an exciting project. This circle here is the University of Manitoba long-term study. One of these circles up here is the University of Alberta long-term study, and down here is the University of Guelph long-term studies. These are the 3 universities in Canada that have long-term studies of this nature. And so the scientists who partnered with us on this came and measured the soil, and we were particularly interested in the organic matter and the biota, the life in the soil. Now, what did we learn in these studies? Well, we learned that, well, let me give you the example from the University of Manitoba long-term study, which we call the Glenlee plots. What we learned is that prairie grassland has higher microbial biomass, or that biota, that living carbon, than crop plots. So here, for example, these are the prairie plots in these black boxes. They've got 1,750 kilograms per hectare of microbial biomass carbon in them. The cropping system, even though it's a no-till conventional cropping system that gets fertilized, only has 1,179. So the living carbon is higher in the natural system. And we talked about this last week, how that carbon gets into these natural systems. In terms of the soil organic carbon, they were actually very similar in the top 15 centimeters between the prairie and the arable systems. But if we go deeper in the profile, which we did in this publication here, we go down to 1.2 meters, we find that these prairie plots, again, have a lot more carbon. So it's one of the things that we've learned is in our agricultural systems, the carbon in the surface soil could be as high as in a natural prairie soil. The living portion is lower, and then if we go deeper in the profile, these grain producing rotations have much less carbon than natural systems. It's good to know what our benchmarks are. And again, energy flows in natural systems are self-regulated, and so we ask ourselves the question, how can we use that regulation to maximize the amount of carbon that we capture in soils, to enrich those soils, make them more productive, and also draw some of that carbon out of the atmosphere, because it's a greenhouse gas. And this just shows the changes in soil carbon that have occurred in the Canadian prairies and the northeastern portion of British Columbia over the last 30 years. The biggest increase in carbon has been in the dryland area here. And one of the reasons for that is this area used to have a lot of summer fallow where nothing was grown for a whole year to conserve water, and that has changed. And so this area really had nowhere to go but up in terms of its soil carbon. But it's something that we're tracking and we're trying to increase. What limits the ability to bring carbon into the soil is photosynthesis. So we need to have plants bringing that carbon, locking that carbon into the soil. So this study that I'm going to show now is focused in Saskatchewan, and in these locations where there's these green triangles, scientists looked at the carbon in the soil in 1986. They benchmarked where they took those soil samples from, and then they went back 21 years later, took soil samples again, and asked themselves the question, how much has the carbon changed? And what they found is in the brown and dark brown soil zones, that's the brown soil zone here, and well, it's called dark brown, but here it's red. So this area here, these are the two drier areas of the prairies. And in these areas, the total soil carbon increased over the 21 years, and the increase was statistically significant. And that's because these farmers adopted continuous cropping because of using no-till practices, which conserved water. So they used conservation agriculture, which conserved water and allowed them to grow plants more often, bringing more carbon into the soil. If we look at the black and the gray and the dark gray parts of the prairies, that's these areas here in the green and the magenta and purple or blue. These areas, there was not a change in total carbon because these areas were already being continuously cropped earlier. But if we look at microbial biomass carbon, we can see there was an improvement in 3 of the 5 soil zones, in the brown, in the dark brown, and in the black soil, which is this dark blue and magenta area together. So the practices that had changed over the 21 years really was having a big impact on the biota part of the soil carbon, which is good news. So conservation agriculture, which is minimizing soil disturbance and keeping cover on the soil, was helping carbon to be sequestered. And the other, well, scientists have measured so many things about the improvement of our prairie soils. Here's work by Dr. Newton Luboya at the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada Research Centre in Alberta, who saw that the conservation agriculture was really increasing the bacterial health of the soil. Similar studies have been done around the world. This one comes from Washington State, which is in the northwest part of the United States. And they also looked at the decline in soil carbon. Soil carbon makes up about just over half of what we call organic matter. And the authors said they'd reached this precariousness point, and now we're wondering what are the practices that could sort of rehabilitate that soil. And what they found is that no-till agriculture, going to sort of the first sort of incarnation of conservation agriculture, which means not tilling the soil and leaving the residue on the surface, that allowed the soil organic matter to come up and be stabilized, but that gets saturated after about 20-25 years. And the introduction of perennials, phases in the rotation, that was required to actually result in a significant increase in the amount of carbon in the soil. Other little things that we learned that were interesting is that when tillage is practiced, having available nitrogen in the soil help to reduce the negative effects of tillage. And that's really important for organic farmers who are relying on legumes and then will incorporate the legumes into the soil. So there's all kinds of nuances. This work comes from Alberta about how to manage the soil. And at this point, a lot of well, certainly I was asking myself, years ago, I need to better understand how plant material actually becomes soil organic matter. So I want to shift gears to some processes now, and uh, and to understand how plant material becomes organic matter. And if you'd like to learn more about this in depth, what I do is I get my students to watch these videos, and more advanced students may want to watch this one. So you can just click on these links, and it'll take you to Dr. Francesca Corrufo's work. She's based in Colorado State University. One of the first things that we need to recognize is that not all soil organic matter is equal. There's two major pools. There's what we call particulate organic matter and mineral-associated organic matter. And particulate organic matter is pieces of decaying plant and animal. Mineral-associated organic matter is plant and animal material that is first processed by soil microbes, and then those microbes die and are embedded in the clay and silt particles. And this carbon tends to be more stable than this carbon. Now here's a diagram which is very complicated, but it shows the density of organic matter and the size of organic matter. And the authors have basically said there's two main pools here. There's the particulate organic matter, that's in red, and the mineral-associated organic matter is in blue. Now, the particulate organic matter is in these soil aggregates, and soil aggregates are connected by fungal networks, and the glomalin, which is a polysaccharide that's excreted by mycorrhizal fungi, which are beneficial fungi, and then the carbon is stabilized in there. And this happens quite quickly when you switch to conservation agriculture. And that's what that picture that just popped up is supposed to tell us. And the particulate organic matter is very important in nutrient cycling, because we want to break up those aggregates every now and again and get the nutrients out of there. So they're kind of a temporary storehouse for nutrients. And so that makes them very important in organic farming. Now, the mineral-associated organic matter is dead microbial cells embedded in clay and silt particles. And this can be a longer-term stable carbon pool, although it is also, like all carbon in the atmosphere, in the soil, is subject to decay and respiration in that natural cycle. As I mentioned before, the mineral-associated carbon must first be processed by soil microbes. And so that's why we are interested in the living part of the soil, the biota of the soil. And so some people talk about this as the eye of the needle. And so Kate Scow from University of California mentioned this in a talk, and I thought that's a great way to think about this. The carbon has to pass through that living carbon. So that's the eye of the needle. And so that's fresh plant material is particularly important for mineral-associated organic carbon, because that's what the microbes like to eat. They much rather eat that than, wheat straw, which is so high in carbon and difficult to break down. And before I leave this, I should mention that there's another way that carbon becomes part of the mineral-associated pool, And that is when the carbon is leaked out of the roots of plants. It's called dissolved organic matter, dissolved organic matter, and it can be converted to mineral associated. And at our Glenlee plots, the rotations that have perennial phases in them actually had 18% more dissolved organic matter than farming system that only had annual crops in the rotation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this diagram if you want to study it by pausing the video, but basically it shows that root carbon is incorporated into mineral associated organic matter much more efficiently than the above ground parts of the plant. Okay, so there you have something about the mechanisms, okay? And so that may spark some questions. I did go through this. I didn't show this table, but I'll leave it up here just for a few moments if you want to read it. It kind of summarizes the particulate organic carbon and the mineral associated carbon, and that may spur some questions for you. All right. Now, soil carbon capture is high on the agenda. People talk about carbon sequestration. And other people say, well, let's not talk about sequestration, let's talk about stewardship. And so this is an important topic because we have an increasing amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So we already talked about how no-till agriculture has helped conservation agriculture move forward. And now I want to talk about about maximizing the efficiency of when we capture that carbon in the soil. How much is it costing us to get that carbon in the soil? And so I like to use the analogy of two different tires. This is a tractor tire that is very worn, and this is a new tractor tire that has these lugs. Which of these tires would produce less slippage as the tractor is trying to pull something heavy across a field? Of course, this one is less efficient because of the slippage, and so the question we ask ourselves, does that affect the efficiency of soil carbon capture? And here again, Dr. Lupuaya has done some groundbreaking work back. As I will show later, he's done this work 25 years ago. And this graph on the right here is a measure of the energy efficiency of the soil. It's basically the respiration per unit of soil microbial biomass, or how much carbon are you losing per unit of biota, of living biomass. And so the higher the number, the lower the efficiency, the more carbon you're losing to respiration. And what Dr. Lupuaya and others have found is that if you adopt conservation agriculture, you increase the efficiency of the carbon in the soil. You lose less carbon per unit of microbial biomass. And in these dry areas of the prairies, the gain was the best. Now, soil type matters. These black soils that have been continuously cropped, they're black because they're naturally in wetter areas, so there's been more organic matter deposited into those soils over the 10,000 years since glaciation. They're inherently more efficient, but management also makes a difference in these dry soils, in these dry zones. And this is Dr. Lupuaya's work from 25 years ago, which was published in the Canadian Journal of Soil Science. And here he's looking again at what we call the metabolic quotient, or the carbon loss per unit of living carbon in the soil. And these dashed lines are all in tillage systems. These solid lines are all in no-till and conservation agriculture systems. And then there are different rotations. So what he learned here, and he and his colleagues learned, is that by adopting conservation agriculture and adding legumes to the cereal-dominated cropping system, the soil became more what we could call carbon efficient. So that's very exciting, and it gives farmers and agronomists something to work with. Now, I'm going to tell you another story which really illustrates the same thing, but I think you'll appreciate it. This is from the Michigan State University Kellogg Research Center, and the work of Dr. Cynthia Kallenbach, who's now at McGill University in Canada, and Stuart Grandy and other colleagues. Now, they worked in plots that were about 35 years or 30 years old. So these are long-term stable experiments, and they compared conventional and organic farming. Conventional farming was corn, soybean, winter wheat, and fertility was added as needed in terms of commercial fertilizer. The organic rotation was exactly the same in terms of the cash crops, corn, soybean, winter wheat, but they added a rye cover crop after the corn and a clover cover crop in the wheat. That would be red clover. Now, in terms of total carbon inputs per year in above ground inputs in those systems, you can see the conventional farming system added more carbon. Not a big surprise. It's getting fertilizer. It's going to grow gangbusters in that really productive, high precipitation farming system. Organic agriculture still had, 6 tons per hectare of biomass, but lower. But then when the scientists looked at the soil organic carbon, they noticed the opposite. Now, really? How can fewer total carbon inputs result in more soil organic carbon? How can that be? The secret was these microbes. This again is the metabolic quotient, or they're calling it carbon use efficiency. This is the amount of carbon that's lost through respiration per unit of microbial biomass in the soil. And thank you to Cynthia for the slide. And what they observed over these 2 growing seasons is that the organic system was more efficient. It lost less carbon per unit of microbial biomass carbon. And so if we bring it back to the analogy of these tires, it's more like the system on the right. There's less slippage, high carbon use efficiency. And the scientific reason for that is the microbial growth rate was sometimes higher in the organic system. So somehow the microbes were growing faster, and that's why they were more efficient. And just going to go back to this slide, and the reason they're growing faster was attributed to these cover crops. These crops were adding nutrient-rich carbon source in the times of the year when the conventional system didn't have anything growing, and that allowed for higher microbial growth rate and ultimately a more carbon efficient soil. Now that's an awful lot to think about. And so what you've just been given is a graduate level education on soil carbon processes. And, there's many scientific papers which were reviewed to create these notes, but hopefully I've been able to explain it in a reasonably practical way so that you can apply these results to farms and to advising farmers. All right, let's carry on. Now, remember the eye of the needle. If we're going to get a lot of carbon in this mineral-associated pool, we have to have healthy microbes. So keeping the microbes happy is now one of our jobs. And how do we do that? How do we keep those microbes happy? Well, one thing we have learned is that soil microbial function can be enhanced in organically managed cropping systems. And these are the studies that have been conducted around the world to demonstrate that. And the processes were written up in this German scientific agricultural science book 100 years ago. So we've known these systems the importance of this for some time. Now, soil pH can affect how healthy that microbial pool is. And there are agronomists concerned that soil pH is dropping. And now we see articles in, this is a December 2024 Top Crop Manager article on how to add lime to soils in the Canadian Prairie region to increase the pH. But what we've learned at Glenlee in Canada and at the DOC trial in Switzerland and other long-term studies is that organic agriculture can maintain a more neutral pH than conventional agriculture where nitrogen fertilizer is used. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. But the question that I'm asking myself now is, will these organic systems maintain a higher carbon use efficiency because of a more neutral pH? And if so, what can we learn from those organic systems to bring into conservation agriculture to allow those to benefit as well? I'm showing here the results from the DOC trial, the oldest organic field experiment in the world. It's in Switzerland. Feeble is the organization, and you can see the conventionally mineral fertilized soils that pH has dropped from 1978 from about 6.3 down to 5.8, whereas the organic systems have remained neutral. And one of the problems when our soils become acidic with a lot of pH is that legumes tend not to grow that well in them. And for that, I've turned to this data from England. The park grass experiment was started in 1856, where they added different levels of legumes and fertilizers to the soil. But what was interesting is that the soils slowly became more acidic, and they did add lime to the soils, and that kept them more basic. But if they hadn't have added that lime, the percentage of legumes in that natural sward was declining. So the moral of this story is that a neutral pH will allow legumes to thrive, and legumes are very important for natural systems agriculture. So again, a chance to pause and think about what we learned, add some questions to the soil pod. Now, the final theme of this module is what I call the global warming wildcard. We're pretty proud of the work we've done in Canada here to adopt conservation agriculture and increase the carbon concentration in the soil. But there is a problem, and that is, as the global temperature increases, the ability to capture or keep carbon in soil is threatened. So let me tell you about the study that these amazing Canadian scientists did. They grew barley and they infected it with radio-labeled carbon. And then they took that barley residue and they put it in soils in all these locations across Canada. And 10 years later, they came back to find out how much of that carbon in the barley was still left. And there were all kinds of different factors, like there were dry areas, wetter, much wetter areas. And so I imagine the scientists were wondering about how many different factors would influence the loss of carbon from these containers. But the conclusion, and I'm quoting from the study, our study demonstrates an overriding predominance of temperature in governing the rate of residue decay, superseding that of extreme differences in soil properties and moisture in temperate climates across southern Canada. So the temperature was really the thing that controlled the loss. And of course, the loss was greater as the temperatures went up. So what does that say for trying to capture carbon when atmospheric temperatures are going up? Others have also done this work, and I'll just point you to some work here by Rossi and again, Lavallée and Cordrufo, who I mentioned earlier, and they looked at what pool of carbon would be lost most easily. And what they found is that the mineral-associated pool was more stable with increasing temperature, but the particulate organic carbon, that carbon that's very easy for us to store with a simple no-till practice, was not as stable. And this is just another illustration from their paper that under warming conditions, the particulate organic carbon decrease, that's the light brown, it decreases proportionally more than the mineral associated. So how do we take this information on board and make it into policy and make it into recommendations to farmers? To my way of thinking, it tells us that we should increase all the pools of carbon, but we should maybe spend a little more attention on the mineral associated carbon, which means having healthy soil biology to increase our carbon use efficiency and put the carbon in a pool that's a little more stable and maybe going to buy us another decade or two until we learn how to manage our economies with less carbon emissions. Another practical response, I mentioned 3-gen organic farm last module, and keeping the soils covered with cover crops in Ontario here keeps them cooler. And so there are other ways of dealing with this problem. Again, you'll have some questions about this. Put them in the pot of soil and let's grow those questions and ideas. We'll discuss them in the future. Okay, I actually wasn't truthful. I have one last point, and I think there's just 2 slides left. And that is the role of animals, which we'll talk about in a few modules. But what researchers have observed is when grazing is not too severe, grazing plants actually increases their ability to add carbon to the soil, or what some people call carbon sequestration. So this is some data from Georgia, where the cattle were grazing Bermuda grass, and there's other examples from the northern Great Plains. Here, for example, this study by Hamilton et al. In 2008, defoliation stimulated carbon exudation from roots by 1.5-fold, which concomitantly increased rhizospheric microbial biomass by the same factor. So rhizosphere is that area of soil right around the root. And so when we think about soil health and when we think about greenhouse gases, ruminant animals can be the brunt of a lot of criticism. But in fact, when you think about the whole system, they can also be very helpful. So that is what I have in Module 2. Thank you very much for paying attention, and I look forward to in the future looking at your your class responses. And I wish you a good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, wherever you are.